Okay, today we're going to be looking at the case of Honig versus Doe, 484 US 305 from 1988. And before we dig into the case, I want to first go over some rules and regulations that had been in place prior to the trial and look at how these could impact the discussion that we're going to have related to Honig versus Doe. So the first is from 1972, Mills versus Board of Education for the District of Columbia. This was a leading case that established that all children are entitled to free public education and training appropriate to their learning capacities. This case gave principals unilateral power that if they could warrant a student's current educational placement being changed based on the possibility that the child could be a danger to themselves or others, then the principals had that ability to make that change without agreement from the parents. Jumping forward to 1975, President Ford had passed the Education of the Handicapped Act, EHA, now known as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA. This is where all public schools accepting federal funds were to provide equal access to education for children with physical and mental disabilities, including emotional disturbances. Public schools were required to evaluate children with disabilities and create an educational plan, IEP, with parent input that would emulate as closely as possible the educational experience of non-disabled students. This is also where the least restrictive environment, LRE, language and protocol came into place. So this is the idea that we are going to provide what students need and not more than what they need to decrease the likelihood that we are segregating disabled students from their non-disabled peers. And lastly, what is heavily discussed in the Honig versus Doe case is the stay put provision, which is the idea that if it is thought that an educational programming change is needed, this cannot happen unless the parent and school have come to an agreement. And if they cannot come to an agreement, then there is a stay put provision where the child must stay in their educational programming pending completion of any review hearings. So what was the issue for Honig versus Doe? The issue was that two disabled students in the San Francisco United School District were suspended, separate situations, for 5 days each, and then recommended for expulsion and notified on the 5th day of their suspension, which elongated their suspension indefinitely until the conclusion of the expulsion hearing. Doe and counsel argued that the extended suspension went against EHA guidelines, stating that an extended suspension went against the stay put provision, essentially suggesting that the educational programming of these students had been changed without following the EHA protocol. Further, it is known that additional protections are afforded for each student that behaviors have been determined to be the result of their disability, which was the case for both of these students. So let's look a little bit deeper at each of the students, John Doe and Jack Smith. John Doe, 24 years of age at the trial, but 17 years of age at the behavior incident resulting in suspension, was socially and physically awkward. During the behavioral incident, he physically attacked another student during a basketball game. As he was escorted away from the situation, he kicked out a window. Jack Smith, 20 years of age at the trial, but a middle school student at the behavior incident, was physically and emotionally abused as a child. He had extreme hyperactivity, low self-esteem, and the behavior that resulted in his 5-day suspension was that he had physically attacked a student, dragged that student into the bathroom, and stole that student's money. Both students had been certified with emotional disturbances, had aggressive tendencies outlined in their IEPs, and both had been suspended for 5 days, then recommended for expulsion with indefinite suspensions afterwards, or before the hearing. So now looking at the case and how things came about, Doe and counsel filed a lawsuit with the district court. The district court ruled in favor of Doe, stating that that the school could not suspend for over 5 days per incident, and that the state is responsible for services if a school district is unwilling. So the argument that Doe had made was that the proposed expulsions and indefinite suspensions for conduct attributable to the disability deprived them of their free and appropriate public education also known as FAPE. An appeal by the petitioner, Bill Honig, who was the state superintendent in California, went to the Ninth District Court. The Ninth District Court also ruled in favor of the plaintiffs, John Doe and Jack Smith. The only difference between the district court and then the appeal to the Ninth District Court was that the Ninth District Court said 10-day suspensions were acceptable versus the district court saying 5-day suspension. So eventually, an appeal made its way to the Supreme Court. The petitioner, Bill Honig, again, California State Superintendent, who was represented in the Supreme Court trial by Asher Rubin, the Deputy Attorney General, said that he believed and supported that EHA stay put provision did not accurately take into account dangerous children, and stated that there was an intolerable burden on the state if they were expected to directly service children that were considered dangerous. So looking at the Supreme Court case, we heard 3 oral arguments. The first, Asher Rubin, who was representing the state superintendent, argued that the San Francisco Unified School District did not appropriately respond to the students' behaviors, but argued that the stay put provision has been altered in multiple other states to include the dangerous child exception, meaning that the stay put provision does not necessarily include students who are emotionally disturbed and have violent tendencies, and argued that there was a lack of policy around dangerous children, and that further it was a burden on the state to provide direct services in situations where the district was unable. Next, we heard from Glenn Nagar, the Justice Department lawyer representing SFUSD, and he argued that the lawsuit was moot on the basis that one student, John Doe, was 24 years old and would no longer be eligible for public education, and that the other student, Jack Smith, although only 20 years old, was no longer living in the school district's region. The Justice Department lawyer, Glenn Nagar, also argued in favor of Mills from 1972, where there should be no change in the child's educational placement unless the principal shall warrant that the continued presence of the child in his current program would endanger the physical well-being of himself and others. So this is where the school district argued that a principal should have unilateral power because of the possibility that a child could be dangerous to himself or to others. And then last we heard from the plaintiff's lawyer, Sheila Brogna. So Sheila argued that principals have a dangerous child exception included in their state provision of EHA. She argued against principals having a dangerous child exception included in their stay put provision of EHA, meaning she did not feel that the stay put provision was neglectful of dangerous children, but rather was incorporating them in the stay put provision as cited by emotionally disturbed children being included into the physical and mental disability section of the EHA. So she suggests that Congress included parents' voice and say to decrease the power that principals have in segregating disabled children, and argued that there is not a lack of policy as emotionally disturbed children were included within the stay put provision, and argued that the school changed educational program before the closure of the expulsion hearing because both children were on extended suspensions, which directly went against the EHA guidelines. It was a 6-2 in favor of the plaintiffs. Similar ruling of the district court and the Ninth District Court, it was found that Congress very much meant to strip schools of the unilateral authority they had traditionally employed to exclude disabled students, particularly emotionally disturbed students, from school. However, it was determined that the case was moot for John Doe since he was 24 years of age and could no longer enroll in public education. And lastly, the court highlighted and noted that educators should and may use a variety of procedures when responding to dangerous students, such as study corrals, timeouts, detention, restrictions of privileges, or suspensions for up to 10 days. When we look at how this impacts us now, we might say that the behavioral planning that is expected of us around students with emotional impairments is directly coming from this court's ruling that we must plan around students and decrease the likelihood of behaviors occurring, especially if we attribute their behaviors as a result of their disability. So, a relevance to administrators. Does your school district continue to suspend students for behaviors that are determined to be as the result of their disability? Does your building have appropriate, consistent, and individualized behavior planning around students with disabilities to prevent the likelihood that behaviors will reoccur? Does your staff have training and understanding around why students with disabilities have additional protections? And how are districts productively using suspensions, so the couple of days the student is out of school, for disabled children to ensure that appropriate behavior supports are in place to decrease the likelihood that the behavior will repeat upon the student's return to school? Meaning that suspension should be used as a time for the team to reconvene, potentially hold a new IEP, behavior planning, or what is ever necessary to ensure that the likelihood of that child's behavior does not reoccur. Looking at some contemporary cases, we found the Community Consolidated School District number 93 versus John F. This was where the community school had offered home tutoring for John for 22 days of the school year at the end of the school year. His parents had objected to the change in placement in a formal letter and did not receive a response. The court from this case determined that the district did not prove FAPE was provided through home tutoring and that John's parents were not allowed adequate participation in the determination of a change in educational placement. The situation for John F. directly ties into what we saw for Honig and Doe because parents were not giving appropriate and adequate participation in the determination of their children's educational placement.